I never thought my retirement years would look like this. One moment I was a devoted grandmother with two beautiful grandchildren who were the light of my life, and the next, I was on the outside looking in, my calls unanswered, my visits denied, all because of money that wasn't even mine to begin with. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Martha Wilson, and at 68 years old, I believed I had everything figured out. I'd saved, planned, and prepared to ensure my family would always be taken care of, especially after Frank passed. $2 million might sound like a fortune to some, but to me it was simply my grandchildren's future, their education, their first homes, their dreams. I never imagined it would become the very thing that tore us apart. When Daniel, my only son, told me I would no longer be welcome to see Emma and Noah unless I changed my will, something inside me finally broke. That day, standing on his doorstep, as he closed the door in my face, I made a decision that would change everything. This is my story. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting a golden glow over the photographs magneted to my refrigerator. Emma's gap-toothed smile in her school picture, Noah holding up his Little League trophy, my grandchildren, my world. I'd been up since 5, preparing my famous apple pie, Emma's favorite, for their weekend visit. The house smelled of cinnamon and butter, the scent of love baked into a perfect golden crust. Just as I was sliding the pie onto the cooling rack, my phone rang. It was Daniel. "Mom, we can't make it today. Something came up with Vanessa's mother," he said, his voice distant and formal in a way that made my heart sink. This was the 3rd canceled visit this month. "Oh," I said, trying to hide my disappointment. "Is everything all right with Judith?" "She's fine. She just wants the kids to attend some charity function with her. Building connections, you know how it is." I didn't know how it was, truthfully. In my world, Saturday mornings were for pancake breakfasts and teaching Emma how to solve complex math problems at the kitchen table. They were for showing Noah how to fix things with his grandfather's old tools. They weren't for parading children around at fancy parties to impress strangers. "I understand," I lied. "Maybe next weekend?" "We'll see. Things are busy right now." The dismissal in his tone was unmistakable. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen surrounded by the quietness that seemed to grow louder each time this happened. 6 years ago, when Frank died suddenly of a heart attack, Daniel and his family had been my lifeline. They'd visited every weekend, called daily, included me in everything. Now, the distance between us grew with each passing month, and I couldn't understand why. I wrapped the pie and placed it in the freezer alongside 2 others, remnants of previous canceled visits. Then I did what I always did when loneliness threatened to overwhelm me. I busied myself with the garden Frank and I had built together, tending to the roses he'd loved so much. Later that afternoon, as I was pruning the yellow roses that had been Frank's pride and joy, I heard a car pull into the driveway. My heart leapt. Perhaps Daniel had changed his mind. But when I turned, I saw Eleanor Reed, my neighbor from 2 doors down, stepping out of her sensible blue sedan. "I brought coffee and thought you might want company," she called, holding up a cardboard tray with 2 cups. "Unless you're busy with family today?" Eleanor and I had been casual acquaintances for years, exchanging pleasantries at neighborhood gatherings but never quite crossing into friendship. Recently widowed herself, she seemed to have an uncanny sense of when the silence in my house grew too heavy. "They canceled," I said simply, peeling off my gardening gloves. "Coffee sounds perfect." Over steaming cups at my patio table, Eleanor's warm brown eyes studied me with the perceptiveness of someone who'd spent decades as a doctor. "3rd time this month," she noted. It wasn't a question. I sighed, letting my guard down just a fraction. "I don't understand what's changed. Daniel used to bring the kids over all the time. Now it's always some excuse." Eleanor took a thoughtful sip of her coffee. Have you asked him directly? I've tried. He just says they're busy, that the kids have activities, that Vanessa's family has expectations. I trailed off, realizing how hollow it all sounded when spoken aloud. Martha, Eleanor said gently, sometimes when patterns change this dramatically, there's something else going on, something people aren't saying. Her words settled uncomfortably in my chest because, deep down, I knew she was right. The changes had started about 8 months ago, around the time I'd met with my financial advisor to update my estate planning. Daniel had been oddly interested in the details afterward, asking questions about my investments, about Frank's life, insurance policy, about the money I'd been setting aside for Emma and Noah since the day they were born. I think it might have something to do with money, I admitted, the words feeling like a betrayal even as I spoke them. Frank left me well off, and I've always been careful with our savings. I've put aside about $2 million for the grandchildren's future. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. That's generous. It's not generosity, it's love, I corrected gently. Frank and we didn't come from much. He worked construction his whole life, and I taught math at Lakeside High for 35 years. We saved everything we could. When he died, his life insurance and our investments, it all added up to more than I ever expected. The money was always meant for the next generation. Does Daniel know about this? I nodded. He's a financial advisor, so of course he wanted to help manage it. But I've kept it in a trust for Emma and Noah. They'll get it when they're older, for college, for starting their lives. And Daniel and Vanessa don't have access to it? Eleanor asked, her voice carefully neutral. The question made me pause. No, it's not their money. And how do they feel about that? The uncomfortable feeling in my chest expanded. Daniel had indeed seemed frustrated when I'd explained the structure of the trust, how it would be managed, until the children were of age. He'd suggested alternative arrangements, ones that would give him and Vanessa more control. But I'd been firm. This was the grandchildren's legacy, not a slush fund for their parents. He wasn't happy, I admitted, but I thought he understood. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Martha, I hate to say this, but it might be time to consider that they're keeping the children from you because they want to pressure you into changing your financial arrangements. The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. No, I shook my head. Daniel wouldn't do that. He's my son. But even as I denied it, flashes of recent memories played through my mind. Vanessa's cold demeanor at our last dinner together. The way she'd mentioned Judith's generous gift of a vacation home with pointed emphasis. Daniel's increasingly transparent questions about my will. I hope I'm wrong, Eleanor said, standing to leave. But either way, don't let them make you feel like you're alone in this. The Golden Years Club meets on Tuesdays at the community center. A bunch of us old-timers get together, have lunch, sometimes take day trips. You should join us. I promised. To think about it, but as I watched her drive away, I felt a creeping sense of dread. If Eleanor was right, if my own son was keeping my grandchildren from me because of money, what did that say about the family I thought I knew? That night, unable to sleep, I did something I'd never done before. I drove past Daniel and Vanessa's house in the exclusive Oakwood Estates neighborhood. It was nearly midnight, but their home blazed with light, cars filling the circular driveway. Through the large bay windows, I could see people in formal attire mingling in their expansive living room. A party. On the very day they'd claimed to be too busy for our regular visit. I parked across the street, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. And then I saw them, Emma in a frilly dress I'd never seen before, and Noah in a little suit, being paraded around by Vanessa's mother, Judith. The woman was practically glowing as she introduced my grandchildren to the other guests, her hands possessively on their shoulders. In that moment, something inside me shifted. No longer was I just a disappointed grandmother. I was angry. And beneath that anger was a dawning realization. My family had changed in ways I couldn't ignore any longer. The next morning, I called Daniel directly. No more tiptoeing around the issue. "I saw the party last night," I said when he answered, skipping our usual pleasantries. The silence on the other end was telling. "Mom, were you spying on us?" His voice was cold, defensive. I was trying to understand why my grandchildren haven't been allowed to see me for weeks. Why you keep canceling our visits with excuses that aren't true. Another pause. "It's complicated." "Then uncomplicate it for me," I insisted, finding strength in my anger. "Tell me why my son is lying to keep me away from Emma and Noah." He sighed, a sound so dismissive it made my blood boil. "Look, Vanessa and I have been talking. We think it's best if the kids spend more time with her family right now. Judith has connections that can help their future." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "And I don't?" The hurt in my voice was unmistakable. "That's not what I meant. It's just... Mom, you're getting older. You live in that big house alone. We worry about the kids being there." It was a flimsy excuse, and we both knew it. I'd never been healthier or more independent. "This is about the trust fund, isn't it?" I asked directly. The silence confirmed it before he could even formulate a denial. "Daniel, that money is for Emma and Noah's future. Not for you, not for Vanessa, not for fancy parties or impressing Judith's friends." When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Gone was the pretense of concern, replaced by a cold frankness I'd never heard from my son before. "Mom, be realistic. Vanessa and I are raising them. We know what's best for their future, not you. If you want to be part of their lives, you need to be reasonable about this. The trust should be in our names, to manage as we see fit." I felt as though he'd slapped me. "So you're holding my grandchildren hostage? See things your way or I don't see them at all." "Don't be dramatic," he scoffed. "We're just being practical. Think about it, Mom. You're not getting any younger." Those words, so callous, so calculating, broke something fundamental between us. In an instant, I saw Daniel not as the little boy I'd raised, but as a stranger who viewed his own mother as nothing more than a checkbook. "I need to see them," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Today." "That's not possible. They have activities scheduled with Judith." "Daniel, they are my grandchildren. I have a right." "No, Mom, you don't," he interrupted. "Legally, you have no rights. Vanessa and I decide who they see." The cruelty of his statement left me breathless. When I finally found my voice again, it was barely above a whisper. "What happened to you?" He didn't answer the question. Instead, he delivered his ultimatum. "When you're ready to be reasonable about the money, we can discuss visitation. Until then, it's better if we all take some space." The call ended, and I sat in my kitchen, Frank's kitchen, our kitchen, surrounded by decades of family photographs and memories, feeling as though I'd woken up in a nightmare. My son, the baby I'd cradled through colicky nights, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the young man I'd put through college, had just severed our relationship over money that wasn't even his. That afternoon, I did something I'd been putting off. I went into Frank's study, a room I'd kept virtually untouched since his death, and opened the safe hidden behind his collection of hardbound classics. Inside were our most important documents: birth certificates, our marriage license, Frank's will, and a sealed envelope with my name written in his familiar scrawl. "Open this when you need to remember who you are," he'd told me years ago. Never, explaining further. Today I needed to remember. Inside was a letter, dated just months before his unexpected death, as if he'd somehow sensed his time was growing short. My dearest Martha. If you're reading this, I'm guessing life has thrown you a curveball, and knowing you, you're wondering if you're strong enough to swing. Let me save you the doubt. You are. You've always been the backbone of this family, even when you let others think it was me. I've watched you navigate challenges with a quiet courage that amazes me every day. Whatever you're facing now, face it with the knowledge that you are more capable than anyone knows, especially you. Remember when we were just starting out? When we had nothing but dreams and determination? You never wavered then, not through the lean years, not through the setbacks. You were never defined by what we had or didn't have. Don't let yourself be defined by it now. Our life together has been my greatest treasure. Whatever material, assets I'm leaving behind pale in comparison to the wealth of your character. Use it all as you see fit, but never let anyone make you feel that your worth is measured by your wallet. All my love, always. Frank. Tears streamed down my face as I read his words again and again. Frank had known, somehow he'd known, that there would come a time when I would need reminding of my own strength. That evening, as the sun set over Lakeside, casting long shadows across our garden, I made my decision. I would not be manipulated. I would not be controlled. And most importantly, I would not allow my son to teach my grandchildren that family bonds could be bought and sold. The $2 million would stay exactly where it was, in a trust for Emma and Noah. But I would no longer sit quietly in an empty house, waiting for permission to be a grandmother. If Daniel wanted to cut me out of their lives over money, I would have to find another way back in. And in the process, perhaps I would need to build a new life of my own. The next morning, I picked up the phone and called Eleanor. "Is that invitation to the Golden Years Club still open?" I asked, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "Always," she replied warmly. "We meet tomorrow at noon." "I'll be there," I promised. Then, after a moment's hesitation, I added, "And Eleanor? Thank you for seeing what I couldn't." As I hung up, I glanced at Frank's letter, now framed on the kitchen wall where I could see it every day. "I'm swinging at that curveball now, Frank," I whispered. "Watch me hit it out of the park." The Lakeside Community Center bustled with activity when I arrived on Tuesday at precisely noon. I'd spent nearly an hour deciding what to wear, something I hadn't done in years. Finally settling on a cornflower blue blouse that Frank always said matched my eyes, I'd driven over with a mixture of determination and apprehension churning in my stomach. Eleanor spotted me hovering near the entrance and immediately waved me over to a round table where 4 other women sat chatting animatedly. "Everyone, this is Martha Wilson," Eleanor announced. "Martha, meet the Golden Years Club." 5 friendly faces turned toward me, and for a moment, I felt like the new kid at school, uncertain and out of place. But then a tall, elegant woman, with silver hair pulled into a stylish twist, extended her hand. "Caroline Jacobs," she introduced herself with a warm smile. "Former district attorney, current busybody. Don't let these other troublemakers intimidate you." The others laughed and introduced themselves in turn. Meredith, a retired librarian with kind eyes and a soft voice. Vivian, who'd owned the local bakery for 40 years and still made the best sourdough in Michigan, according to everyone at the table. Gloria, a former nurse with a booming laugh who immediately insisted I call her Glow. And Beatrice, the oldest of the group at 79, who had taught piano to half the town's children over the decades. "We've been trying to get Eleanor to bring you around for ages," Vivian said, pouring me a cup of coffee from the carafe on the table. "She says you make an apple pie that might give my pastries a run for their money." "Blasphemy," I replied with a tentative smile, accepting the coffee gratefully. "But I'd be happy to bake one for our next meeting so you can judge for yourself." "Oh, she's going to fit right in," Glow declared, clapping her hands together in delight. Throughout lunch, the conversation flowed easily from local gossip to book recommendations to debates about the town council's new development plans. Not once did anyone ask why I'd finally decided to join them or pry into my personal concerns, yet I felt an understanding in their glances that told me Eleanor had shared at least some of my situation. As we were finishing our meal, Caroline leaned toward me. "We're planning a day trip to the Art Museum in Grand Rapids next week. There's a new exhibit on Impressionist painters I've been dying to see. You'll join us, won't you?" The offer was so casual, so genuine, that it caught me off guard. When was the last time someone had simply invited me to do something enjoyable, with no obligations attached? "I'd love to," I found myself saying, surprising even myself with the enthusiasm in my voice. As we were leaving, Beatrice pulled me aside. "Eleanor mentioned you taught mathematics," she said. "The community center runs a tutoring program for underprivileged students. They're desperately short on math tutors. Just something to consider if you find yourself with time on your hands." Her suggestion lingered with me as I drove home, the idea of using my teaching skills again both appealing and slightly terrifying. It had been years since I'd been in a classroom, but the thought of helping young minds navigate the complexities of algebra and calculus stirred something inside me that had been dormant for too long. When I arrived home, there was a voicemail from Daniel. His tone was clipped, businesslike, as if he were addressing a difficult client rather than his mother. "Mom, Vanessa and I have been discussing the situation. We're willing to meet this weekend to talk about the trust fund arrangements. If we can come to an agreement, we can work out a visitation schedule for the kids. Call me back." Not, "I miss you," or "the kids miss you." Just a cold negotiation. My grandchildren's presence in my life in exchange for their inheritance. My finger hovered over the call button for a long moment before I set the phone down without returning his call. The Martha from last week would have jumped at any chance to see Emma and Noah, would have considered compromise, would have done anything to avoid conflict. But I wasn't that Martha anymore. Instead, I called my lawyer, Stanley Green, who had been handling my affairs since before Frank passed away. Stanley had known us for decades, had helped Frank set up his will, and later assisted me with creating the trust for my grandchildren. "I need to make sure the trust is ironclad," I told him without preamble when he answered. There was a slight pause. "Has something happened, Martha?" "Daniel wants control of the money. He's keeping the grandchildren from me until I agree." Stanley's sharp intake of breath told me all I needed to know about what he thought of that tactic. "The trust is already quite secure," he assured me. Frank was very specific about how he wanted things structured. "But if you're concerned, I can add additional protections." "Do it," I said firmly. "And Stanley, I want to make another appointment to discuss revisions to my will." After hanging up, I stood in my kitchen, staring at the photographs on my refrigerator, particularly one of Daniel and me taken at his college graduation. His arm was around my shoulders, both of us beaming with pride and love. Where had that Daniel gone? When had money become more important to him than family? The sound of a car pulling into my driveway broke through my thoughts. Through the window, I saw Daniel's sleek black SUV and my heart began to race. I hadn't called him back, hadn't agreed to any meeting, yet here he was. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door before he could knock. "Daniel," I said, keeping my voice level. "This is unexpected." He stood on my porch looking uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like he used to do as a boy when he knew he was in trouble. "You didn't call back," he said, as if that explained everything. "I was busy," I replied simply, not inviting him in. His eyebrows rose slightly at that. I had never been too busy for him before. "Can I come in? We need to talk." I hesitated, then stepped aside. He moved past me into the house, his expensive cologne lingering in the air. In the living room, he took his usual seat in Frank's old recliner, something that had never bothered me before, but now felt like an invasion. "I spoke with Mom," I said, remaining standing. "My lawyer," I clarified when confusion crossed his face. "About the trust." Daniel's expression hardened. "So you're digging in your heels?" "No, I'm protecting what Frank and I always intended for Emma and Noah." "Mom," he sighed, with the exaggerated patience one might use with a difficult child, "you're not thinking clearly about this. Vanessa and I are in a much better position to manage that money." "To manage it for the children's future? Or to use it now?" His silence was damning. "That's what I thought," I said quietly. "The answer is no, Daniel. The trust stays as it is." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then I don't think we can work out a visitation schedule right now." The words were exactly what I had expected, yet they still cut deeply. My own son was using my grandchildren as pawns in a financial negotiation. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me, "do you hear yourself? You're keeping your children from their grandmother because I won't give you control of their money." "It's more complicated than that," he insisted, not meeting my eyes. "Vanessa's family has expectations. Her mother has been very generous with us. And you think that buys her the right to replace me in my grandchildren's lives?" He flinched at the directness of my question. "No one's replacing you. We just feel that at this point in their development, the kids benefit more from Judith's connections and lifestyle." The casual cruelty of his statement took my breath away. For the first time, I truly saw what Daniel had become. A man who measured relationships by their material value, who had forgotten the lessons Frank and I had tried so hard to teach him about what really mattered in life. "Your father would be heartbroken to hear you talk this way," I said softly. Daniel stood abruptly, his face flushing. "Don't bring Dad into this. He's not here, and things change. You need to accept that." "Yes, things do change," I agreed, a new resolve hardening inside me. "So here's how it's going to be. I will not be manipulated. I will not sign over my grandchildren's future to satisfy your or Vanessa's current desires. And I will not beg for scraps of time with Emma and Noah." His eyes widened in surprise. He had expected me to cave, to negotiate, to compromise. He had never before seen this version of his mother, the woman who had once stood firm against school bullies who targeted him in 3rd grade, the woman who had fought the insurance company for months after Frank's initial claim was denied, the woman who had always been steel beneath a soft exterior. "What are you saying?" he asked uncertainly. "I'm saying that when you're ready to bring my grandchildren to visit without conditions attached, without using them as bargaining chips, my door will be open. Until then, you need to leave." "Mom." "Now, Daniel." For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but something in my expression must have told him it would be futile. Without another word, he strode past me and out the front door, slamming it behind him with enough force to rattle the family photographs on the wall. I sank onto the couch, trembling with a mixture of anger and grief. For a full 5 minutes, I sat there in silence, letting the emotions wash over me. Then I did something I hadn't done since Frank died. I went to the cabinet where we kept the good scotch, poured myself a finger's worth, and drank it in one burning swallow. The warmth spread through my chest, stealing my resolve. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about standing up for myself, for Frank's memory, for the values we had tried to instill in our son. The next morning, I awoke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. First, I called Stanley and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. Then, I called Eleanor. "Remember that tutoring program Beatrice mentioned?" I asked when she answered. "How do I sign up?" Eleanor's delighted response warmed me. "I'll pick you up in an hour. The program coordinator will be at the center today." True to her word, Eleanor arrived precisely 60 minutes later, and Together, we drove to the Lakeside Community Center. The tutoring program, I learned, operated 3 days a week after school and served children from the lower-income neighborhoods across town. Many were struggling in their classes, particularly in mathematics, with no money for private tutors and parents who worked long hours. Melissa Jenkins, the coordinator, was a harried but passionate young woman who nearly wept with relief when I offered my services. "You have no idea how badly we need someone with your expertise," she gushed, immediately pulling out a schedule. "We have at least 15 students who specifically need help with algebra and calculus. When can you start?" "How about tomorrow?" I suggested, surprising myself with my eagerness. Later that afternoon, I sat across from Stanley in his office as he reviewed the changes to my will that I had requested. "Martha, are you absolutely certain about this?" he asked, peering at me over his reading glasses. "It's quite a significant change." "I've never been more certain of anything," I assured him. "Daniel has made his priorities clear. I'm simply adjusting mine accordingly." Stanley nodded, making the final notations. "And what about your house? Have you given any thought to downsizing, as we discussed last year?" I hadn't. Not seriously. The idea of leaving the home where Frank and I had built our life together, where we had raised Daniel, had always seemed like a betrayal of sorts. But now, looking around Stanley's office, with its modern decor and clean lines, I found myself wondering if a fresh start might be exactly what I needed. "Actually," I said slowly, "I think I might be ready to consider it." Stanley looked pleased. "I have a friend in real estate who specializes in helping seniors transition to more manageable living situations. She could show you some options. No pressure." "That would be perfect," I agreed. By the time I left Stanley's office, the foundation of my new life was taking shape. The trust for Emma and Noah remained intact, but my will had been revised to include substantial bequests to the Lakeside Community Center's tutoring program, the local scholarship fund for aspiring teachers, and several other causes close to my heart. What remained of my estate would be divided among my grandchildren, with specific provisions to ensure the money couldn't be accessed by their parents. It was a statement, certainly, but it was also a reflection of my values, the same values Frank and I had tried to instill in Daniel, the same values I hoped might someday reach Emma and Noah, even if I wasn't there to teach them directly. The next several weeks passed in a blur of activity. 3 afternoons a week, I tutored at the community center, finding unexpected joy in working with young minds again. The Golden Years Club became a fixture in my life, with weekly meetings and outings that filled my social calendar more thoroughly than it had been in decades. And most significantly, I began looking at condos in Lakeview Gardens, a modern senior community on the opposite side of town from Daniel's upscale neighborhood. It was during a tour of a particularly lovely corner unit with a small garden patio that I received a text message from an unfamiliar number. When I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. "Grandma, it's Emma. Mom doesn't know I'm texting you." I took Aunt Lisa's phone when she visited. "I miss you so much. Dad says we can't see you because you're being difficult about money stuff. Noah cries sometimes because he misses your cookies. Please just give Dad what he wants so we can come visit again." I read the message 3 times, tears blurring my vision. The real estate agent, sensing my distress, discreetly stepped out onto the patio to give me privacy. My fingers hovered over the keypad. What could I say? How could I explain to a 12-year-old that her father was using her as leverage in a financial power play? How could I make her understand that giving in to such manipulation would only teach her the wrong lessons about family and values? Finally, I typed, "Emma, sweetheart, I miss you and Noah terribly, every day. This isn't about money. It's about principles and promises I made to protect your future. I hope someday you'll understand. Know that I love you both endlessly, and my door is always open to you. Always." After sending the message, I quickly added, Please delete these messages so you don't get in trouble. And be careful with your aunt's phone. Almost immediately, I saw the typing indicator, then, I have to go. Mom's coming. Love you, Grandma. And then she was gone. I stood in the middle of the empty condo, clutching the phone to my chest, awash in conflicting emotions. The pain of separation was as acute as ever, but now there was something else too. A fierce pride in my granddaughter's resourcefulness and courage, a renewed determination to be worthy of her love and trust. Ms. Wilson? The real estate agent had returned, her expression concerned. Is everything all right? I took a deep breath, composing myself. Yes, thank you, and I'd like to make an offer on this unit. The decision felt right, like another step forward on this unexpected new path. The condo was bright and modern, with none of the painful memories that clung to every corner of the house I'd shared with Frank. It was a place where I could start fresh, create new traditions, build a life that was fully mine. 2 days later, my offer was accepted, and I found myself facing the daunting task of downsizing 50 years of possessions into a space half the size of my current home. Eleanor and the rest of the Golden Years Club immediately volunteered to help, turning what could have been an overwhelming chore into something approaching a party. Keep, donate, or trash, Caroline directed, setting up 3 distinct areas in my living room. And be ruthless. If you haven't used it in a year, it goes. We worked our way through the house room by room, starting with the easier spaces like the guest bedroom and working toward the more emotionally charged areas. Each item came with a decision, often accompanied by a story that had my friends alternately laughing or wiping away tears. When we reached Frank's study, I hesitated at the door. It was the one room I'd left largely untouched since his death, a shrine of sorts to the man who had been my partner for 42 years. We can leave this for another day, Eleanor suggested gently, noting my hesitation. No, I said firmly. It's time. Inside, everything remained exactly as Frank had left it. His reading glasses perched on a stack of engineering journals, his favorite pen lying beside a half-completed crossword puzzle, his collection of hardbound classics lining the shelves. Even the air seemed preserved, still holding the faint scent of his pipe tobacco despite the years that had passed. This, Glow said reverently, running her fingers along the spines of Frank's books, is love. You can feel it in this room. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. What do you want to keep? Caroline asked pragmatically, her legal mind already categorizing and organizing. The books, I said immediately. His chair, the globe. I moved around the room, touching each item that held a piece of Frank's spirit. But the rest? The rest can go. It wasn't easy, dismantling this shrine I'd maintained. But as we carefully packed Frank's treasures, something shifted inside me. I wasn't losing him. I was taking the best parts of him with me into this new chapter, leaving behind the dust and stagnation of grief. That evening, after my friends had gone, I sat alone in Frank's chair with a cup of tea and one of his favorite books in my lap. For the first time in 6 years, I felt his presence not as a ghost haunting the empty spaces of our home, but as a gentle force urging me forward. I'm doing it, Frank, I whispered into the quiet room. I'm swinging at that curveball, just like you said I could. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was in the kitchen, sorting through decades of accumulated utensils and gadgets, when the doorbell rang. Opening it, I found myself face to face with Lisa, Daniel's younger sister from Frank's first marriage. Lisa! I exclaimed, genuinely delighted. Though she was technically my stepdaughter, I had raised her from the age of 8 and had always considered her my own. Unlike Daniel, however, Lisa had moved to Chicago after college, and our contact had been limited to holiday visits and occasional phone calls. She hugged me tightly, the familiar scent of her perfume bringing back memories of the teenager who had once filled our house with the drama and energy of adolescence. "I hear you're selling the house," she said without preamble. "Daniel called me furious." "Ah," I sighed, leading her into the kitchen. "I should have guessed he'd reach out to you. Coffee?" "Please," she nodded, taking a seat at the counter. "And before you ask, yes, Emma borrowed my phone to text you. I let her. In fact, I suggested it." I paused in the act of measuring coffee grounds, turning to look at her in surprise. "You did?" Lisa's expression was a mixture of discomfort and resolve. "What Daniel and Vanessa are doing is wrong. Using the kids as pawns in some financial negotiation? That's not how you and Dad raised us." The simple validation of my feelings brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "Thank you for saying that." We sat in companionable silence as the coffee brewed, the familiar domestic rhythm soothing us both. "So," Lisa said finally, accepting the steaming mug I offered, "tell me what's really going on. All Daniel would say is that you're being stubborn about the kid's inheritance and punishing him by moving away." I couldn't help but laugh at that, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. Is that what he thinks? That selling a house that's become too big for me and moving 8 miles across town is about punishing him? "You know, Daniel," Lisa shrugged. "Everything has always been about him." There was no judgment in her voice, just a simple statement of fact that we both recognized as truth. Daniel had always been the center of attention, Frank's only son, the academic star, the financial success story. Even I had been guilty of reinforcing that self-centered worldview, making excuses for his behavior, prioritizing his feelings and needs. "Tell me your side," Lisa prompted, taking a sip of her coffee. So I did. I told her everything about the trust Frank and I had established for Emma and Noah, about Daniel's increasing pressure to change the arrangements, about the canceled visits and final ultimatum. I told her about my decision to stand firm, about my new involvement with the tutoring program and the Golden Years Club, about the condo at Lakeview Gardens. Lisa listened intently, nodding occasionally, her expression growing increasingly troubled. When I finished, she set down her mug with a decisive click against the countertop. "I'm proud of you," she said firmly. "It would have been easier to give in, to let Daniel manipulate you. But you're doing the right thing." Her approval meant more than I could express. "The hardest part is not seeing Emma and Noah," I admitted. "I miss them every day." "I know," Lisa sighed. "I've tried talking to Daniel about it, but he's completely under Vanessa's influence these days. And Vanessa is under Judith's influence," I finished for her. "Exactly. That woman is a piece of work. She's convinced Vanessa that your family isn't good enough for them, that the kids need to be raised with certain advantages and connections." The revelation wasn't entirely surprising, but it still stung. And the money would help provide those advantages. "Bingo," Lisa confirmed grimly. "Look, I don't want to betray confidences, but Daniel and Vanessa are in some financial trouble. They've been keeping up appearances, but Judith has been bankrolling their lifestyle for months. The big house, the luxury cars, the private school for the kids. It's all a facade. They're drowning in debt." I closed my eyes, momentarily overwhelmed by this new information. Why didn't he just come to me, if they needed help? "Because Daniel knows you well enough to know you wouldn't fund their lifestyle choices," Lisa interrupted gently. "You would have helped with necessities, with the kids' education, with medical bills. But country club, memberships, designer wardrobes, keeping up with the Joneses, or in this case, the Parkers. You and Dad raised us with different values." She was right, of course. Frank and I had lived comfortably but modestly, always prioritizing education and experiences over material possessions. We had tried to instill those same values in our children, apparently with mixed results. "What do I do now?" I asked, feeling suddenly exhausted by the complexity of it all. Lisa reached across the counter and squeezed my hand. Exactly what you're doing. Live your life. Be happy. Keep the door open for Emma and Noah, but don't let Daniel manipulate you into enabling his bad choices. After Lisa left, promising to stay in touch and to be my inside connection to Emma and Noah whenever possible, I returned to sorting kitchen items with a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was clearer now, illuminated by the simple wisdom of doing what was right rather than what was easy. That evening, as I boxed up the last of the kitchen essentials I planned to take to my new home, my phone rang. Daniel's number flashed on the screen, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something, perhaps the lingering effect of Lisa's visit, perhaps simple maternal instinct, compelled me to answer. "Hello, Daniel." "Is it true?" he demanded without greeting. "Are you really selling the house?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "The closing is next month." There was a long pause. Then his voice returned, tight with barely controlled anger. "How could you do this? This is our family home. This is where I grew up, where Dad lived. How can you just get rid of it?" The irony of his sudden sentimentality about a home he rarely visited anymore wasn't lost on me, but I chose not to point it out. "I'm downsizing to a place that makes more sense for me now." "Where? Where are you moving?" "Lakeview Gardens. I've purchased a condo there." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, the anger replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. "Mom, is this because of what's been happening? With the kids? Because if it is, we can work something out. You don't have to sell the house." For the first time, I heard the little boy beneath the man's voice, the child who, despite everything, still needed the stability of knowing his childhood home existed, that his mother was where she had always been. "Daniel," I said gently, "this isn't about punishing you or trying to force your hand. This is about me choosing a new path that makes sense for my life now. I'm tutoring at the community center. I've made new friends. I'm involved in activities I enjoy. The house is too big for just me, and it's time for a change. But what about us? What about when we visit?" The assumption that they would visit, despite months of deliberate absence, was so typically Daniel that I almost laughed. "The condo has a guest room," I assured him. "Whenever you and the children want to visit, there will be space for you." "And the trust?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral now. "Is that still non-negotiable?" "Yes," I said firmly. "That hasn't changed, and it won't. The money stays in trust for Emma and Noah's future, as your father and I always intended." I expected anger, perhaps another ultimatum. Instead, there was only silence, followed by a deep sigh. "I need to think about all this," he said finally. "It's a lot to process." "Take all the time you need," I replied, meaning it sincerely. "My door is always open to you and the children, no conditions attached." After we hung up, I stood in my half-packed kitchen, surrounded by the physical evidence of my life's transition. The conversation with Daniel had been civil, a marked improvement over our last interaction, but I harbored no illusions that everything was suddenly resolved. The road ahead would have its challenges, its disappointments, perhaps even its heartbreaks. But for the first time since Frank's death, I felt fully alive, fully present in my own story. No longer was I simply a widow, a grandmother, a retired teacher defined by my relationships to others. I was Martha Wilson, a woman discovering that life at 68 could be just as full of possibility and promise as life at 28 had been. As I closed the last box and sealed it with tape, I found myself looking forward to tomorrow, to the next chapter, to the unfamiliar but exhilarating freedom of being exactly who I chose to be. Moving day arrived with an unexpectedly bright September sky, the kind of perfect autumn morning that seemed at odds with the bittersweet task at hand. The moving company I'd hired, recommended by Caroline, who swore they had handled her late. Husband's book collection with reverence arrived promptly at 8. 3 efficient young men began loading my carefully labeled boxes and the furniture I'd decided to keep into their truck. I stood on the front lawn, watching as they worked, each item carried out feeling like another thread of my old life being snipped away. The dining table where our family had shared thousands of meals, the grandfather clock Frank had restored the year Daniel started high school, the antique secretary desk where I'd graded papers for decades. "It's just stuff," Eleanor reminded me gently. She had arrived an hour earlier with coffee and bagels, instinctively knowing I'd need support. "The memories go with you." I nodded, grateful for her presence and practical wisdom. "I know. It's still harder than I expected." As the movers were wrapping the last of my belongings, a sleek black SUV pulled up across the street. My heart skipped as I recognized Daniel's car. He sat there, engine running, watching the activity but making no move to get out or approach. "Is that him?" Eleanor asked, following my gaze. "Yes," I confirmed, my eyes still fixed on the vehicle. "That's Daniel." Eleanor made a small "oomph" sound that perfectly conveyed her opinion of a son who would watch his mother move without offering to help. "Should we invite him over?" I considered this for a moment, then shook my head. "No. If he wants to speak to me, he knows where I am." For nearly 20 minutes, Daniel remained in his car, watching as the movers finished loading the truck. Once or twice, I thought I saw movement that suggested he might be getting out, but ultimately, he stayed put. Only when the moving truck pulled away, leaving me and Eleanor standing beside my packed sedan, did he finally drive off without a word or gesture of acknowledgement. "Well," Eleanor said after a moment of silence, "that was certainly something." I tried to laugh, but the sound caught in my throat. "He's always been stubborn. Even as a little boy, he'd dig in his heels rather than admit he was wrong." "Sounds like someone else I know," Eleanor teased gently, bumping my shoulder with hers. This time, my laugh came easier. I prefer to call it principled. The drive to Lakeview Gardens took less than 20 minutes, yet it felt like crossing into a different world. Unlike the older, established neighborhood I was leaving, the senior community was modern and meticulously planned, with winding paths connecting clusters of elegant condominiums surrounding a central clubhouse and gardens. My new home was everything the real estate agent had promised: bright, open, easy to maintain, and completely free of the emotional ghosts that had lingered in the corners of my old house. The floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room overlooked a small but charming garden patio, and beyond that, a walking path that meandered alongside a decorative pond. "It's perfect," Eleanor declared as we toured the space. "Absolutely perfect for this new chapter." The movers worked efficiently, placing furniture according to my directions and stacking boxes in the appropriate rooms. By late afternoon, the major pieces were in place, and though I was surrounded by unpacked boxes, the condo was beginning to feel like a space where I could build a new life. Eleanor stayed until early evening, helping me unpack the essentials: bedding, toiletries, a few kitchen items, before reluctantly departing for a previous engagement. "I'll be back first thing tomorrow," she promised. "Don't you dare tackle those heavy boxes without me." After she left, I stood in the middle of my new living room, suddenly overwhelmed by the silence and the magnitude of what I'd done. For 50 years, I'd lived in only 2 homes. First, the small starter house Frank and I had purchased as newlyweds, then the larger family home where we'd raised our children. Now, at 68, I'd willingly uprooted myself, shedding decades of accumulated possessions and memories to start fresh in an unfamiliar place. What if I'd made a terrible mistake? The thought ambushed me, bringing with it a wave of anxiety that made my hands tremble. What if this new beginning was actually just an ending in disguise? What if, in my determination to stand firm against Daniel's manipulation, I'd cut myself off from the family connections that had defined my entire adult life? I sank onto the couch. Frank's favorite leather sofa, one of the few pieces I couldn't bear to part with, and allowed myself a moment of pure, unadulterated fear. The silence pressed in around me, broken only by the unfamiliar sounds of my new surroundings. The distant hum of the central air system, the occasional voice or footstep from the unit above, the soft bubbling of the pond's aerator outside my window. The doorbell's chime startled me so badly I nearly fell off the couch. Gathering myself, I peered through the peephole, half expecting to see Eleanor returning with some forgotten item. Instead, I found myself looking at Robert Henderson. Call me Bob, my new next-door neighbor who had briefly introduced himself that morning while the movers were unloading. He stood on my doorstep holding what appeared to be a covered casserole dish. I opened the door, suddenly conscious of my disheveled appearance after a day of moving. "Hope I'm not disturbing you," Bob said with an easy smile that crinkled the corners of his kind blue eyes. "I thought you might appreciate not having to worry about dinner after a long day of moving." He extended the dish, which I accepted gratefully. "That's incredibly thoughtful. Thank you." "It's nothing fancy," he assured me. "Just a simple lasagna, my late wife's recipe. She always said it was important to welcome new neighbors properly." I knew from our brief morning introduction that Bob was a 72-year-old widower who had moved to Lakeview Gardens 3 years earlier, after retiring from his architecture practice. What I hadn't fully registered then, but couldn't help noticing now, was his tall, trim figure and the distinguished touch of silver at his temples that complemented his otherwise still dark hair. "Would you like to come in?" I offered impulsively. "There's not much furniture yet, but I unpacked a bottle of wine earlier." Bob's smile widened. "I'd like that very much, but only if you're sure I'm not imposing." "After bringing homemade lasagna, you're definitely not imposing." As I led him into my half-unpacked kitchen, I realized I was smiling for the first time since the moving truck had arrived that morning. Something about Bob's easy kindness and the simple neighborly gesture had pierced through my melancholy, reminding me that new beginnings brought opportunities as well as challenges. We ate at my small kitchen island, perched on the only 2 bar stools I'd kept from my old house, sharing the lasagna, which was delicious, and a bottle of Cabernet I'd been saving for a special occasion. The conversation flowed easily, touching on our careers, his in architecture, mine in education, our experiences of loss — his wife Janet had died of cancer 5 years earlier — and our adjustments to life at Lakeview Gardens. "The first few weeks are the hardest," Bob admitted, refilling our wine glasses. "Everything feels strange and temporary, like you're staying in a hotel rather than living in your own home." "That's exactly how I feel," I agreed, relieved to hear my emotions, articulated so precisely. Like I'm just visiting this life, not actually living it. "It passes," he assured me. "One morning you wake up and realize you've stopped thinking of your old place as home. This becomes home instead." He gestured around at my box-filled condo. "Having good neighbors helps, of course." "I'll have to find some of those," I teased. "Too late. You're stuck with me now," he replied with a wink. "And fair warning, I'm persistent. If you don't join me for the community breakfast on Sunday, I'll just keep knocking until you do." By the time Bob left around 9 o'clock, taking his empty casserole dish but leaving the remainder of the wine as a housewarming gift, my earlier anxiety had been replaced by a tentative optimism. Perhaps this new chapter wouldn't be defined by what I'd left behind, but by what lay ahead. I slept surprisingly well that first night in my new home, lulled by the combination of physical exhaustion, good wine, and the lingering warmth of new friendship. The next morning, true to her word, Eleanor arrived early, bearing more coffee and Danish pastries from Vivian's bakery. "So," she said casually as we unpacked kitchen items, "Caroline mentioned seeing you and Bob Henderson sharing dinner last night when she walked her dog." I shot her a look of mock outrage. "Is nothing private in this community?" Absolutely nothing, Eleanor confirmed cheerfully. Might as well embrace it. Now details, please. And don't leave anything out. I rolled my eyes but found myself recounting the evening with perhaps more enthusiasm than the simple neighborly gesture warranted. Eleanor listened with unconcealed interest, her eyes twinkling. He's quite the catch, you know, she informed me when I'd finished. Half the widows at Lakeview have tried to get his attention since he moved in. Very selective, our Bob. It was just lasagna, I protested, feeling an unexpected warmth creep into my cheeks. A neighborly welcome. Mm-hmm, Eleanor hummed skeptically. Janet's special recipe lasagna. Do you know how many women have tried to get that recipe out of him? He guards it like a state secret. I was saved from further teasing by the arrival of the rest of the Golden Years Club, each member bearing housewarming gifts and ready to help with the unpacking. Within hours, my kitchen was fully organized, bathroom essentials were in place, and the living room had transformed from a box maze to a comfortable, inviting space. I think this calls for a celebration, Beatrice declared as we collapsed onto various chairs and sofas in the newly arranged living room, Martha's first dinner party in her new home. Oh, I don't know if I'm ready for that yet, I demurred, looking around at the still considerable work to be done. Not today, obviously, Caroline clarified, but soon, very soon, before you have time to overthink it. Glow nodded enthusiastically. And you should invite that handsome architect next door. What's his name again? Bob Henderson, Eleanor supplied helpfully, ignoring my warning glance. They had dinner together last night. Did they now? Vivian's eyebrows rose with interest. Martha Wilson, you dark horse. It was neighborly lasagna, I insisted, though I couldn't help laughing at their collective matchmaking enthusiasm. Nothing more. Neighborly lasagna, Caroline repeated skeptically. Is that what they're calling it these days? Their teasing was good-natured, and surprisingly, not unwelcome. How long had it been since anyone had seen me as a woman who might attract a man's interest, rather than just as a widow, a mother, a grandmother? The possibility, however remote, that I might have a romantic future ahead of me rather than just behind me, was both terrifying and exhilarating. Fine, I conceded with mock exasperation. Dinner party next Friday. All of you are invited, and yes, I'll invite Bob too. But, I added firmly, only if you promise not to embarrass me with this ridiculous matchmaking. Their chorus of innocent denials fooled neither of us. The following week passed in a blur of activity. I continued unpacking and organizing my new home, added framed photos and artwork to previously bare walls, and even planted a few fall flowers in the containers on my patio. 3 afternoons a week, I tutored at the community center, finding genuine joy in helping struggling students grasp mathematical concepts that had eluded them. On Sunday morning, true to his word, Bob appeared at my door to escort me to the community breakfast at the clubhouse, where he seemed to take particular pleasure in introducing me to everyone we encountered. By the time we returned, I had collected at least a dozen new acquaintances and several invitations to various social activities. See? Bob said as we strolled back toward our condos. Told you it gets easier. You're practically a Lakeview Gardens institution already. I laughed at the exaggeration, but had to admit there was truth in what he said. Already, this place was beginning to feel less like a hotel and more like a home, its rhythms and routines becoming familiar, its unfamiliar sounds less jarring to my ears. The only shadow on my otherwise brightening horizon was the continued silence from Daniel. Though I had texted him my new address and phone number, the landline had not made the move with me. I'd received no response. Lisa called regularly with updates about Emma and Noah, even managing to sneak me a few photos from a recent visit, but direct contact with my grandchildren remained elusive. On Wednesday afternoon, as I was returning from my tutoring session, at the community center, I spotted an unfamiliar car parked in my designated space. Drawing closer, I realized with a start that it was Vanessa's white luxury sedan. My daughter-in-law sat inside, tapping at her phone, apparently waiting for me. For a brief, shameful moment, I considered driving past, pretending I hadn't seen her. What could this unexpected visit mean except another attempt to pressure me about the trust fund? But curiosity and a lingering hope for reconciliation won out. I parked in a visitor space nearby and approached Vanessa's car. She looked up as I neared, her expression unreadable behind large designer sunglasses. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped out of the vehicle. "Martha," she greeted me stiffly, "we need to talk." I nodded, keeping my own expression neutral. "Would you like to come inside?" Without waiting for her answer, I led the way to my condo, unlocking the door and stepping aside to let her enter first. It occurred to me that this was the first time Vanessa had seen my new home. Yet she offered no comment about the space. Not even the hollow compliment social niceties might demand. "Can I get you something to drink?" I offered as she perched uncomfortably on the edge of my sofa. "Water? Tea?" "No, thank you. This won't take long." Vanessa's tone was clipped, businesslike. She removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes that were slightly reddened, as if she'd been crying recently. "Daniel doesn't know I'm here." That caught me by surprise. In the 12 years of their marriage, I had never known Vanessa to act independently of my son in matters regarding our family. "I see," I said carefully, taking a seat across from her. "What can I help you with, then?" Vanessa took a deep breath, seeming to steel herself. "I need to borrow $50,000 from you, personally, not from the Children's Trust." The request was so unexpected, so direct, that for a moment I simply stared at her. May I ask what for?" "Daniel's in trouble," she admitted reluctantly. "He made some investments that didn't work out. We're facing foreclosure on the house if we can't make the payments. Mother offered to help, but she wants conditions I'm not comfortable with." My mind raced to process this information. Lisa had mentioned they were having financial difficulties, but I hadn't realized things had progressed to this point. "Have you spoken with financial advisors?" I asked. "Sometimes there are options, restructuring the mortgage or—" "We've explored every option," Vanessa interrupted impatiently. "Daniel's been working with his colleagues at the firm. This is our last resort. We wouldn't be asking if we weren't desperate." The irony wasn't lost on me. After months of Daniel refusing to let me see my grandchildren unless I changed the trust arrangements, his wife was now sitting in my living room asking for a direct loan. Part of me, the hurt and angry part, wanted to remind Vanessa of this, to perhaps suggest that access to their children shouldn't be contingent on financial arrangements. But the glimpse of genuine fear beneath Vanessa's carefully maintained facade stopped me. Whatever our personal conflicts, this was about more than just money. This was about Emma and Noah's home, their stability. "I'll need to speak with Stanley, my lawyer," I explained, "to arrange the transfer of funds properly, and I'd want something in writing, a formal loan agreement with terms for repayment." Hope flickered across Vanessa's face. "So you'll do it? You'll help us?" "I'll help Emma and Noah," I clarified gently. "Which means helping you and Daniel, yes. But Vanessa, this can't continue. Using the children as bargaining chips, cutting me out of their lives. That has to stop." Her face flushed with what might have been shame, or perhaps just embarrassment at having the unspoken dynamic finally addressed directly. "It wasn't my idea," she said quietly, "keeping the children from you. That was Daniel's decision." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical, of this attempt to distance herself from actions she had at minimum enabled. "And my mother's," she added quickly. "Judith can be persuasive. She never thought your family was good enough for us, even before all this." "And what do you think, Vanessa?" I asked, genuinely curious. In all our years as family, I realized I had never really known my daughter-in-law's true thoughts or feelings. She had always presented a polished surface, reflecting whatever seemed most advantageous in the moment. She looked startled by the direct question, as if no one had asked for her actual opinion in a very long time. I think, she began hesitantly, then seemed to gather courage. I think Emma and Noah miss their grandmother. I think using them as pawns in a financial dispute is wrong. And I think my mother has too much influence over our family decisions. The candor of her response surprised me. Before I could reply, she continued, her words coming more rapidly now, as if a dam had broken. Do you know what Emma did last week? She failed a math test. Deliberately. Told her teacher she didn't understand the material and needed extra help. When I suggested a tutor, she said she only wanted her grandmother, because you were the best math teacher in Lakeside. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. And Noah keeps asking why we don't visit you anymore. He thinks you're mad at him for something he did. The thought of my grandson blaming himself for our separation broke my heart. Oh, Vanessa. They must be so confused. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. Daniel won't discuss it with them. Just says we're all too busy, right? Now that we'll visit soon. But they know something's wrong. Children always do. For several moments we sat in silence, the weight of our fractured family situation hanging heavy between us. Finally, I made a decision. Here's what I propose, I said. I'll help with the $50,000, as a loan with terms we'll work out, with Stanley. In return, I want regular visits with Emma and Noah, not supervised, not contingent on anything else, just normal grandmother time. And I want us to be honest with them about what's been happening, in an age-appropriate way. No more letting them think they've done something wrong. Vanessa hesitated, then nodded slowly. I think that's fair. But Daniel... I'll talk to Daniel, I assured her. This has gone on long enough. After Vanessa left, I sat for a long time in my living room, processing our conversation. The situation was more complex than I had realized, with Daniel's financial troubles adding desperation to what I had assumed was simple greed. And Vanessa, it seemed, was caught between competing loyalties. To her husband, her mother, her children, perhaps even to her own conscience. I made 2 calls that afternoon. The first was to Stanley, explaining the situation and asking him to draw up loan documents as quickly as possible. The second was to Daniel's cell phone. He answered on the first ring, his voice guarded. Mom? Hello, Daniel. I think it's time we talked. Really talked. In person. A pause, then. Vanessa told you. Yes, and I'm going to help, but we need to clear the air about everything else. I took a deep breath. I'm coming over tomorrow. At 10. Please make sure Emma and Noah are there. It's time they saw their grandmother. To my surprise, he didn't argue. Okay, he agreed quietly. 10 o'clock. Sleep eluded me that night. I tossed and turned, rehearsing what I would say, to Daniel, to the children, how I would navigate this delicate reunion without causing more harm. Around 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep entirely and moved to my small patio, wrapping myself in a blanket against the autumn chill. The night was clear, stars scattered across the dark sky like diamond dust. In the stillness, with only the gentle bubbling of the pond as accompaniment, I found myself thinking of Frank, wondering what he would advise in this situation. His voice seemed to whisper on the breeze. Trust yourself, Martha. You know what's right. And I did know. Despite the hurt, despite the manipulation, despite everything that had happened, one truth remained constant. I loved my grandchildren, and they needed their grandmother in their lives. The rest, the money, the pride, the who was right or wrong of it all, was secondary. The next morning, I dressed with careful deliberation, choosing a familiar blue sweater that Emma had once declared was the exact color of the sky on the best day ever. I drove to Daniel and Vanessa's house with my heart hammering against my ribs, both eager and anxious about the reunion ahead. Vanessa opened the door before I could ring the bell, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside to let me enter. "They don't know you're coming. We thought it would be a nice surprise." The house was quieter than I remembered, missing the usual sounds of children playing or the television blaring cartoons. "Where is everyone?" I asked. "Daniel took them to the park for a bit. He thought you and I should talk first, get on the same page before they get back." She led me into the kitchen where a pot of coffee was already brewing. "He's agreed to the loan terms. Stanley emailed the documents this morning." I accepted the mug she offered, more to have something to do with my hands than from any desire for caffeine. "And the visitation?" A flicker of discomfort crossed Vanessa's face. "He's coming around to the idea. It helps that we need the money so urgently. But there's something else you should know." My stomach tightened with apprehension. "What's that?" "Judith is coming for dinner tonight. She doesn't know about the loan or that you're here today. She thinks we've decided to sell the house and move in with her. It's what she's been pushing for." I took a moment to absorb this information. "I see. And have you decided that?" "No," Vanessa said firmly, surprising me with her conviction. "Absolutely not. But Daniel hasn't told her that yet. He's afraid of her reaction." She hesitated, then added reluctantly, "Mother can be vindictive when she doesn't get her way." Before I could respond, the sound of the front door opening was followed by excited children's voices. A moment later, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, freezing mid-sentence when she saw me. "Grandma?" she whispered, as if afraid I might be a mirage. "Hello, sweetheart," I managed, my voice thick with emotion. Emma stood motionless for another heartbeat, then launched herself across the kitchen and into my arms with such force that I nearly dropped my coffee mug. I set it hastily on the counter just in time to catch her, burying my face in her hair as tears sprang to my eyes. "You came back," she mumbled against my sweater. "You really came back." "Of course I did," I assured her, pulling back just enough to look into her face. "I never left you, Emma. Not really." Noah appeared in the doorway next, his small face lighting up with joy when he spotted me. "Grandma!" he shouted, racing toward me. I knelt to catch him, gathering both children into a fierce embrace as Daniel watched silently from the threshold. "I missed you both so much," I told them, not bothering to hide my tears. So much." "We missed you too," Noah said solemnly. "Dad said you were too busy for us now, but I knew that wasn't true. You're never too busy for cookies and stories." I met Daniel's gaze over the children's heads, silently acknowledging the hurt his lie had caused. To his credit, he had the grace to look ashamed. "Your father was wrong about that," I told Noah gently. "I am never, ever too busy for you two, and I never will be." Emma pulled back slightly, her expression serious beyond her 12 years. "Are you going to stay? Or do you have to go away again?" "I'm not going anywhere," I promised, "but we do need to talk about some changes that have happened." I glanced at Daniel and Vanessa, seeking their permission to continue. When they both nodded, I went on. "I've moved to a new house, a condo in Lakeview Gardens. It's smaller than my old house, but it has a swimming pool and walking trails and a special room just for when you come to visit." "Why did you move?" Noah asked, his forehead wrinkling in confusion. "Because Grandma needed a change," Daniel interjected, finally finding his voice. "Just like sometimes you rearrange your bedroom because you want it to feel different." And he hesitated, then continued with visible effort. Because there have been some misunderstandings between Grandma and me that made it harder for us all to see each other for a while. What kind of misunderstandings? Emma asked sharply, her perceptiveness reminding me so much of myself at her age that it made my heart ache. Daniel looked at me helplessly, clearly struggling with how to explain our conflict in terms a 12-year-old could understand without damaging her trust in either of us. Sometimes, I said carefully, adults disagree about things. Your dad and I had different ideas about some money that Grandpa Frank and I saved for your future. But we're working it out now, and the important thing is that we all love each other, even when we disagree. Emma studied my face intently, then her father's, clearly weighing our explanation against her own observations and instincts. After a moment she nodded, apparently satisfied for now. Can we see your new house today? Not today, sweetheart, Vanessa intercepted smoothly. Grandma just came to visit for a little while, but soon, I promise. How about this weekend? I suggested, looking to Daniel and Vanessa for confirmation. You could come for lunch on Saturday, see the new place, maybe go swimming at the community pool. Yes! Noah pumped his fist in excitement. Can we, Dad? Please? Daniel hesitated only briefly before nodding. That sounds like a plan. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of catching up, with Emma and Noah eagerly sharing all the developments I had missed in their lives. Noah's new position as goalie on his soccer team, Emma's science project on renewable energy, the family of rabbits that had taken up residence under their deck. I soaked in every detail, every gesture, every laugh like a woman who had been wandering in a desert suddenly offered water. Eventually, Vanessa gently reminded the children about homework that needed to be completed before dinner, sending them reluctantly upstairs with promises that I would visit again very soon. Once they were out of earshot, she turned to Daniel. Your mother and I have worked out an arrangement, she began carefully. She's going to help us with the mortgage situation. As a loan, in return, we need to ensure she has regular access to the children. Daniel nodded, avoiding my gaze. I know. She already sent the paperwork, Vanessa continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. And I've been thinking about tonight, about telling Mother our decision. I think it's time. We set some boundaries with her, Daniel. For the children's sake, if nothing else. I watched in silent amazement as my timid, conflict-avoidant daughter-in-law stood her ground, her chin raised in determination. Whatever catalyst had brought about this change in Vanessa, whether desperation, maternal instinct, or simply reaching a breaking point with Judith's interference, it was transformative. Daniel seemed equally surprised by his wife's newfound assertiveness. You're right, he agreed after a moment. It's time. As I prepared to leave, wanting to be gone before Judith arrived for what promised to be a tense family dinner, Daniel walked me to my car. For several moments we stood in awkward silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. I'm sorry, he said finally, the words sounding rusty, as if he hadn't used them in a very long time. For keeping the kids from you, for everything. I studied my son's face, the boy I had raised now hidden beneath layers of adult pride and fear and ambition, and felt a complex mixture of love, disappointment, and hope. I know, Daniel, and I forgive you, but what happens now matters more than apologies. Show me you mean it by your actions going forward. He nodded, understanding. The implicit message, trust, once broken, must be rebuilt slowly, deliberately, through consistent effort and demonstrated change. Saturday at noon? He confirmed. For lunch at your new place? Saturday at noon, I agreed, reaching out to squeeze his arm gently. And Daniel? Thank you for letting me see them today. As I drove away from the house that had once represented all my family dreams and now symbolized so much conflict and hurt, I felt lighter than I had in months. The road ahead wouldn't be smooth, Judith's influence wouldn't evaporate overnight, Daniel's financial troubles wouldn't be solved by a single loan, and the trust issues between us would take time to heal. But for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt genuine hope, not just for reconciliation, but for the possibility of something better, a more honest relationship with my son, a stronger connection with my grandchildren, and a family dynamic based on mutual respect rather than manipulation or obligation. When I pulled into my parking space at Lakeview Gardens, I was surprised to find Bob waiting on my patio, a concerned expression on his face. "Everything okay?" he asked as I approached. "You looked upset when you left this morning. I was worried." The simple kindness of his concern after such an emotionally charged day was my undoing. Tears that I had carefully controlled in front of the children and Daniel suddenly spilled over. Without hesitation, Bob stepped forward and enfolded me in a gentle embrace, asking no questions, simply offering comfort. After a moment, I pulled back, embarrassed by my display of emotion. "I'm sorry," I said, wiping at my eyes. "It's been a complicated day." "Those are often the most important kind," he replied with a small smile. "Want to talk about it? I make a mean cup of tea." I found myself nodding gratefully. "Tea sounds perfect, but only if you let me return the favor from my first night. Here, dinner's on me tonight." Bob's smile widened. "Deal. But fair warning, I'm an excellent listener, so be prepared to tell me everything." As we walked into my condo together, I realized with a start of surprise that it truly did feel like coming home now. Not because the space itself had changed, but because I had. In confronting Daniel, in standing my ground while still extending grace, in beginning to rebuild those fractured family connections, I had somehow also strengthened my sense of self. The Martha who entered her new home that evening was not the same woman who had stood watching movers pack away her old life just weeks earlier. She was stronger, more certain of her own worth, more willing to fight for what mattered and let go of what didn't. And as I closed the door behind us, I found myself looking forward to sharing that discovery with my new friend, to seeing where this unexpected journey might lead next. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect autumn day with just enough crispness in the air to justify the pumpkin-spiced cider simmering on my stove. I had been awake since 5, too excited about Emma and Noah's first visit to my new home to sleep any longer. Every surface gleamed from my nervous cleaning the night before, and the guest bedroom had been prepared with careful attention to their preferences. Dinosaur sheets for Noah's twin bed, and constellation-patterned bedding for Emma's. The refrigerator was stocked with their favorite foods, and I had spent yesterday afternoon baking cookies, muffins, and of course, my signature apple pie. Perhaps I was overcompensating, trying to pack months of missed grandmother time into a single visit, but I couldn't help myself. These children were my heart, and I wanted everything to be perfect for them. Bob had stopped by the previous evening, ostensibly to borrow sugar, but clearly checking on my mental state. After hearing about the upcoming visit, he had immediately offered to make himself scarce. "Family reunions need space," he'd said with understanding. "But I'm just next door if you need reinforcements." His thoughtfulness had touched me deeply, as had the small garden trowel and packet of daffodil bulbs he'd brought as a housewarming gift for later. We had made tentative plans to plant them together on Sunday, giving me something to look forward to after the children's visit ended. At precisely noon, the doorbell rang. Taking a deep breath, I smoothed my hands over my sweater and went to answer it, my heart pounding with anticipation. The sight that greeted me when I opened the door nearly brought me to tears. Emma and Noah stood on my doorstep, each holding a bouquet of flowers and wearing their best clothes, as if this were a formal occasion rather than a family lunch. Behind them, Daniel and Vanessa hovered awkwardly, their own arms laden with gift bags and what appeared to be a homemade casserole. "Welcome!" I exclaimed, stepping back to usher them inside. Come in. Let me show you around." Children barreled past me, thrust their bouquets into my hands, and immediately began exploring the condo with excited exclamations. Noah headed straight for the sliding glass door leading to the patio, pressing his nose against it to peer at the pond beyond, while Emma did a slow turn in the living room, taking in the familiar furnishings now arranged in this new space. "It's smaller than your old house," she observed, "but cozier. I like it." "Thank you, sweetheart," I replied, deeply pleased by her approval. That's exactly what I was going for. Daniel and Vanessa hung back, still in the entry hall, looking uncertain about their welcome despite our reconciliation earlier in the week. I turned to them with a smile, determined to set the tone for this new chapter in our relationship. "Thank you for coming," I said warmly, accepting the casserole Vanessa offered. "And for bringing this? It smells wonderful." "Chicken and wild rice," Vanessa explained, her voice slightly strained. "It's a new recipe I've been wanting to try." Daniel cleared his throat, shifting the gift bags he was carrying. We brought a few housewarming things. Nothing fancy, just some things we thought might be useful." "How thoughtful," I said sincerely, leading them into the kitchen. "You can put them anywhere. The cider's almost ready, and lunch will be in about half an hour." As I arranged their flowers in vases and finished preparing our meal, the initial awkwardness gradually dissipated. Noah discovered the community pool visible from my patio and begged to go swimming later. Emma found the bookshelf in the guest bedroom stocked with new young adult novels I'd purchased with her in mind. And Daniel, after a glass of cider and some gentle encouragement from Vanessa, began to relax enough to notice and comment on the arrangement of my new home. "You've done a nice job with the place, Mom," he said, examining the built-in shelving I'd filled with family photographs and treasured mementos. "It suits you." "Thank you," I replied, recognizing the olive branch in his words. "It's been an adjustment, but I'm finding my way." When we sat down to lunch, a simple spread of homemade soup, fresh bread, and Vanessa's casserole, I was struck by how normal it felt, as if the months of estrangement had never happened. Emma chattered about school and her friends. Noah demonstrated his soccer goalie moves using a dinner roll as a ball, until Vanessa gently intervened. And Daniel actually laughed, a genuine sound I hadn't heard from him in far too long. After we'd eaten, the children clamored to go swimming. Vanessa had wisely packed their suits and towels just in case, so while they changed in the guest bathroom, I retrieved the pool access card Eleanor had helped me obtain. "It might be a bit chilly," I warned as we walked the short path to the A community center where the indoor pool was located. The outdoor pool closed for the season last month. "That's okay," Noah assured me seriously. "I'm basically part polar bear." Emma rolled her eyes at her brother's claim, but smiled at me conspiratorially, slipping her hand into mine as we walked. That simple gesture of affection, so casually offered, meant more to me than she could possibly know. Daniel and Vanessa followed a few steps behind, their voices low as they discussed something that seemed to require serious expressions and occasional glances in my direction. I chose not to worry about it, focusing instead on the warm weight of Emma's hand in mine and Noah's excited bouncing as the pool came into view through the community center windows. The next few hours passed in a blur of splashing, laughter, and the peculiar joy that comes from watching beloved children at play. I didn't join them in the water, my swimming days were largely behind me, but sat contentedly on a poolside chair, occasionally engaging in conversation with other Lakeview Gardens residents who stopped by to introduce themselves. "Your grandchildren are delightful," observed Edith Walker, a silver-haired woman I recognized from the community breakfast. "So well-mannered." "Thank you," I said proudly, watching as Emma helped Noah practice floating on his back. "They're the light of my life." "I heard you had some family troubles," Edith continued, lowering her voice to a confidential level. "Glad to see things working out. Family's all we've got in the end, isn't it?" Before I could respond to this rather direct acknowledgement of my private matters, apparently Eleanor hadn't exaggerated about the Lakeview Gardens grapevine. Bob appeared at the pool entrance, dressed casually in jeans and a light sweater. He spotted me immediately and made his way over, nodding politely to Edith. "Afternoon, ladies," he greeted us, his smile warm. "Just thought I'd drop by and see how the family visit is going." Edith's eyebrows rose with interest, her gaze ping-ponging between us. "I should be going," she said, standing with a meaningful look that promised gossip would soon be circulating. "Lovely to meet you, Martha. Do join us for bridge night sometime." As she departed, Bob took the vacated seat, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "I've just accelerated your integration into the community gossip cycle by about 3 weeks," he observed. "Hope you don't mind." I laughed, surprisingly unbothered by the prospect. At this point in life, I find I care much less about what people think. "One of the best parts of getting older," Bob agreed, "along with senior discounts and being able to say exactly what you mean." While we were chatting, Noah spotted Bob and immediately paddled to the edge of the pool, calling out excitedly, "Hey, your grandma's neighbor, the one with the cool boat." Bob looked startled, then pleased. "That's right. How did you know about my boat?" "Grandma told us," Emma explained, joining her brother. "She said you have a sailboat at the marina and that maybe someday you could show us how it works." It was my turn to be startled. I had indeed mentioned Bob's sailboat during our lunch conversation, but certainly hadn't suggested any future sailing excursions. Emma, it seemed, was doing some matchmaking of her own. "Well," Bob recovered smoothly, "I'd be happy to give you a tour sometime, with your parents' permission, of course." This exchange naturally led to introductions when Daniel and Vanessa emerged from the pool a few minutes later. I watched with a mixture of anxiety and hope as Bob shook hands with my son, the two men sizing each other up in that peculiar way males often do. To my relief, Daniel was perfectly civil, and the conversation remained light as the children dried off and we all walked back to my condo together. If he had any thoughts about my newly developing friendship with Bob, he kept them to himself. Back at the condo, while the children changed into dry clothes, Vanessa pulled me aside in the kitchen, her expression serious. "Martha, Daniel, and I have been talking. We owe you an explanation about what happened at dinner with Judith the other night." I busied myself preparing hot chocolate for the children, giving her space to continue at her own pace. After a moment, she went on. "It didn't go well. When we told her we weren't selling the house or moving in with her, she was furious. When she found out we'd borrowed money from you instead of accepting her offer, she actually stormed out." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, meaning it. Despite my dislike of Judith's interference in our family, I knew her rejection would be painful for Vanessa and create additional tension for all of them. Vanessa shook her head. "Don't be. It was actually clarifying. The things she said, the way she tried to manipulate us, it made me see that this pattern has been going on for years. She's never respected our boundaries or our choices unless they aligned with what she wanted." She paused, twisting her wedding ring nervously. Daniel finally stood up to her, told her that if she wanted to be part of our lives, she needed to accept that we make our own decisions as a family. That included reconciling with you and making sure Emma and Noah have their grandmother in their lives. I was stunned by this revelation. Daniel, who had always been eager to please authority figures, who had spent months keeping his children from me under pressure from Vanessa and Judith, had finally found the courage to stand his ground. "How did she take it?" I asked, already guessing the answer. "About as well as you'd expect," Vanessa replied with a grimace. "She threatened to cut us off completely. No more financial help, no more social connections. Said we'd regret choosing that woman over her." Despite myself, I winced at being reduced to that woman in Judith's eyes. And now? Now we figure out how to live within our means, Vanessa said with surprising determination. The loan from you will keep us afloat while we make some changes. Daniel's looking at other employment options, firms that don't require the same level of Oz image maintenance. I'm going back to work. I've already had 2 interviews for marketing positions. The transformation in Vanessa was remarkable. Gone was the appearance-obsessed woman who had once seemed more concerned with social climbing than authentic connection. In her place stood someone more grounded, more genuine, a mother prioritizing her family's well-being over outward impressions. I'm proud of you both, I told her sincerely. These changes won't be easy, but I think they'll lead to something better for all of you. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. Thank you for saying that, and for giving us another chance, after everything. Our conversation was interrupted by the children bounding back into the kitchen, followed by Daniel and Bob deep in conversation about sailing. The afternoon stretched into early evening, with board games at the dining table and more of Vanessa's casserole for dinner, supplemented by my apple pie for dessert. When it was finally time for them to leave, the goodbyes were reassuringly ordinary, plans were made for their next visit, hugs were exchanged, and promises to call soon were offered. No tension, no uncertainty, just the comfortable rhythms of family maintaining connection. After they'd gone, Bob helped me clear away the dishes, moving around my kitchen with surprising familiarity given how new our friendship was. They seem like good kids, he observed, loading the dishwasher. And your son. He's got your eyes. And his father's stubbornness, I added wryly. Though I suppose I contributed to that trait as well. Bob chuckled. Funny how clearly we can see our own flaws reflected in our children. Janet and I used to joke that our daughter got all our worst qualities combined into one extremely determined package. You have a daughter? I realized there was still so much I didn't know about this man who was becoming increasingly important in my daily life. Rebecca, he nodded. She's 43 now, lives in Seattle with her wife and their 2 adopted boys. They try to visit a couple times a year. The conversation flowed easily from there, sharing stories of our children growing up, the challenges and joys of parenthood, the unexpected ways family dynamics evolve over time. By the time Bob left around 9 o'clock, I felt I knew him much better, not just as a friendly neighbor, but as a fellow traveler on this journey of aging, loss, and renewal. The next morning, true to our plan, Bob arrived with gardening gloves and a small trowel of his own. Together, we planted the daffodil bulbs along the edge of my patio, ensuring that spring would bring a burst of golden blooms to welcome the new season. Planting bulbs is an act of faith, Bob mused as we patted down the soil over the last one. Burying something seemingly dead in the cold ground, trusting that it contains everything needed for new life when the conditions are right. I smiled at the apt metaphor. Rather like starting over at our age. Exactly like that, he agreed, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way I was coming to find endlessly charming. Speaking of new beginnings, I have something to ask. You. My heart did a ridiculous little flutter that I would have found embarrassing if anyone could have seen it. Oh? The Lakeside Harvest Festival is next weekend, he said, brushing dirt from his gloves. I've volunteered at the boat display for years, showing people the basics of sailing knots and navigation. I could use an assistant if you're interested. It wasn't quite the invitation I'd expected, but it was delightful nonetheless. I don't know the first thing about sailing, I admitted. All the better, Bob replied with a grin. You can play the role of the curious learner while I demonstrate. The kids love it when they can teach an adult something new. Put that way, how could I refuse? I'd be happy to help, I agreed. That afternoon, I received a text from Emma. Thanks for having us, Grandma. I had the best time. Noah says your new house is epic, which is high praise from him. Can we come? Next weekend, too? My heart swelled with joy at this simple evidence that our bond remained strong despite the months of separation. "Of course, sweetheart," I replied. "But I'm volunteering at the Harvest Festival on Saturday. Maybe you could meet me there?" Her response came almost immediately. "Yes!" "Mom already said we can go. Dad has to work, but Mom will bring us. Can we see your friend's boat?" I laughed out loud at her transparent attempt at matchmaking. "I'll ask him," I promised, already knowing what Bob's answer would be. The week that followed marked a turning point in my new life. Each day brought small but significant steps forward. My tutoring sessions at the community center expanded to include Emma's struggling math class, for which she was simultaneously mortified and delighted. I attended my first bridge night at Edith Walker's condo, discovering that I remembered more of the game from my college days than I'd expected, and most surprisingly, I received an invitation to lunch from Vanessa, just the two of us, to discuss family matters. We met at a small cafe halfway between our homes, an intentionally neutral location that acknowledged the still fragile nature of our reconciliation. Vanessa looked different somehow, her trademark perfect appearance slightly softened, her designer handbag replaced by something more practical, her smile more genuine than I could remember seeing it. "I wanted to update you on our situation," she began after we'd ordered. "Daniel has accepted a position with a smaller firm. The salary is lower, but the hours are better, and there's less pressure to maintain a certain lifestyle." "How does he feel about the change?" I asked, genuinely concerned about my son's adjustment. "Relieved, mostly," Vanessa admitted. "He's been under so much stress trying to keep up appearances, especially after some of his investments went south. This feels like a fresh start." She hesitated, then added, "I've accepted a marketing position with a local company too. Part-time for now, while the kids are still in school, but it feels good to be using my degree again." "That's wonderful," I said sincerely. "I always admired your creativity. You were wasted just planning charity galas." Vanessa looked startled, then pleased by the compliment. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you." We chatted a while longer about practical matters, her work schedule, arrangements for the children, their planned downsizing of certain expenses, before she finally broached what I suspected was the real purpose of our meeting. "Martha, there's something else I wanted to discuss," she said, her expression turning serious. "It's about Judith." I nodded, bracing myself. I assumed she might be part of this conversation. "She wants to reconcile," Vanessa said bluntly. "On her terms, of course. She's invited us all to Thanksgiving at her house, including you." I nearly choked on my tea. Me? After she called me that woman and tried to erase me from my grandchildren's lives. I know, Vanessa sighed. "It's not a genuine olive branch. It's a power play, her way of showing that she's still the family matriarch who can summon everyone to her table." "Then why tell me about it?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. Vanessa leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Because I wanted your advice. Daniel thinks we should go, that it's better to maintain family harmony even if it means enduring her manipulation. But I'm not so sure. The children would rather be with you, honestly. And after everything that's happened." I sat back, processing this unexpected request for my opinion. For years, Vanessa had treated me as an afterthought in family planning, someone to be accommodated rather than consulted. This shift in our dynamic was as surprising as it was welcome. "What matters most," I said carefully, "is that you and Daniel make this decision together, as a united front. Whatever you decide, I'll support it." I paused, then added, "But if you're asking what I would do?" "I wouldn't go. Life's too short to spend holidays with people who don't truly value your presence." Vanessa nodded slowly, considering my words. "That's what I've been thinking too. And Martha, I'd like to host Thanksgiving this year. A smaller gathering, just us, if you'd like to come." The invitation, so simply offered after all the conflict and manipulation of recent months, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "I'd like that very much," I managed. "Thank you." As we parted outside the cafe, Vanessa surprised me with a brief, but genuine hug. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for everything. I know we can't erase the past few months, but I hope we can build something better going forward." "I'd like that," I replied, returning the embrace. "For all our sakes, especially the children's." The Lakeside Harvest Festival arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp air, golden sunshine, and just enough breeze to make the decorative flags and banners ripple festively throughout the town square. Bob picked me up early, his practical sedan loaded with nautical equipment for the boat display. "Ready for your debut as a sailing assistant?" he teased as I slid into the passenger seat. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, smoothing my hands over the new sweater I'd purchased specifically for the occasion. Though I'm still not entirely clear on what I'm supposed to do. "Mostly hand me things and look impressed," Bob explained with a wink. "Oh, and keep an eye out for your grandchildren. Emma texted me last night to make sure we'd have time to show them the real boat at the marina afterward." I gaped at him. "Emma texted you? How does she even have your number?" "Apparently she got it from your phone when you weren't looking," he replied, seeming more amused than concerned by this invasion of privacy. "Clever girl. Reminds me of my grandsons, always 3 steps ahead of the adults." I made a mental note to have a gentle conversation with Emma about boundaries, even as I secretly admired her determination. "She's very invested in our friendship," I explained diplomatically. "Friendship, huh?" Bob cast a sideways glance at me, his expression unreadable. "Is that what we're calling it?" Before I could formulate a response to this rather direct challenge to my careful terminology, we arrived at the festival grounds, and the moment for clarification passed. Setting up the boat display took the better part of an hour, during which Bob patiently taught me the basics of several nautical knots and explained the function of various sailing implements whose names I immediately forgot. By the time the festival officially opened at 10 o'clock, I felt marginally more prepared for my role as assistant. The morning passed in a pleasant blur of activity. Children of all ages visited our booth, some genuinely interested in sailing, others merely attracted by the colorful flags and the chance to handle real boating equipment. Bob was wonderful with them all. Patient with the youngest visitors, engaging with the teenagers, never talking down to anyone regardless of their knowledge level. Watching him demonstrate a particularly complicated knot to a wide-eyed 8-year-old. Boy, I felt a familiar warmth spreading through my chest. It had been a long time since I'd allowed myself to feel this kind of attraction, this budding affection for someone new. Frank had been gone for 6 years, but only now did I feel truly ready to open my heart again. "You're staring," Bob murmured, when the boy moved on to the next booth, his tone gently teasing. "Just admiring your teaching technique," I replied, primly, though the color rising in my cheeks probably gave me away. He laughed softly. "If you say so." "Oh, look, I think your delegation has arrived." Following his gaze, I spotted Vanessa making her way through the crowd, Emma and Noah darting ahead of her with excitement. The children reached our booth first, launching into enthusiastic greetings and immediately demanding to see the cool boat stuff Bob had promised to show them. Vanessa arrived at a more sedate pace, smiling apologetically. "Sorry we're late. Traffic was a nightmare getting into town." "You're just in time," Bob assured her, already helping Noah handle a complex-looking pulley system. "We've had a steady stream of visitors all morning, but it's quieting down now for the lunch rush." While Bob engaged the children with increasingly elaborate demonstrations, Vanessa drew me aside slightly, her expression bright with suppressed excitement. "I have news," she said in a low voice. "I wasn't going to say anything yet, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. We told Judith we won't be coming to her Thanksgiving dinner. We're hosting our own, remember? And Daniel was the one who told her, stood firm even when she tried every guilt trip in her arsenal. "That's wonderful," I replied, genuinely proud of my son's growth. "How did she take it?" Vanessa grimaced. "About as well as you'd expect. There were tears, accusations, the whole dramatic scene. But Daniel didn't cave. He told her she was welcome to join us if she could be civil to everyone, including you, but that the days of her dictating our family choices were over." "I'm impressed," I admitted. "That couldn't have been easy for him." "It wasn't," Vanessa confirmed. "But afterward, he said he felt like a weight had been lifted, like he could finally breathe again." She paused, then added softly, "I think he's starting to understand what really matters." Our conversation was interrupted by Emma calling for our attention. "Grandma, Mom, look! I can tie a bowline knot with my eyes closed now." We dutifully turned to watch her demonstration, applauding her newfound skill with appropriate enthusiasm. Noah, not to be outdone, immediately demanded his turn to show off what he'd learned, and the next hour passed in a pleasant haze of family connection and new discoveries. Eventually, the children's attention spans began to wane, and Vanessa suggested they explore the rest of the festival. "We can meet back here in an hour or so," she proposed. "Then maybe Bob can show us that sailboat he's been telling the kids about." Bob readily agreed to this plan, and after extracting promises from the children to stay with their mother at all times, we watched them disappear into the festival crowd. Once they were gone, I began helping Bob reorganize the display materials that had been disrupted by the children's enthusiastic explorations. "Your grandchildren are delightful," he commented as we worked. "Bright, curious, engaging. They clearly adore you." "The feeling is mutual," I assured him, smiling at the thought of them. "I'm so grateful to have them back in my life." "And your daughter-in-law seems different from what you described before, more grounded." I nodded, considering this observation. "She's finding her own voice, I think, standing up for what she believes is right instead of just following others' expectations." "Rather like someone else I know," Bob remarked with a meaningful glance in my direction. Before I could respond to this rather pointed comparison, a commotion near the festival entrance caught my attention. A tall, elegantly dressed woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair was engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument with a festival security volunteer. Even from a distance, her imperious bearing and designer outfit made her stand out amidst the casual festival crowd. "Is that—" Bob began, following my gaze. "Judith Parker," I confirmed grimly. "Vanessa's mother." As if sensing our attention, Judith's head turned in our direction. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted me, and after dismissing the security volunteer with a wave of her hand, she began making her way directly toward our booth. "This should be interesting," Bob murmured, moving subtly closer to my side. "Would you like me to make myself scarce?" "Absolutely not," I replied firmly. "Whatever is about to happen, I'd appreciate having a friend nearby." His hand found mine and squeezed briefly, a silent confirmation of support that gave me courage as Judith Parker approached, her expression a careful mask of social pleasantness that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Martha," she greeted me with cool politeness. "What a surprise to find you here." "Is it?" I replied mildly. "I live in Lakeside, have for over 40 years. Judith's smile tightened fractionally. "Yes, well, I was actually looking for Vanessa and the children. I thought we might spend some quality family time together." "They're exploring the festival," I explained, offering no further details. "I'm sure they'll turn up eventually." An awkward silence fell, during which Judith's gaze flicked to Bob, then back to me, clearly wondering about our relationship, but too well-bred to ask directly. After a moment, I took pity on her curiosity and performed a brief introduction. "Bob Henderson, this is Judith Parker. Vanessa's mother. Judith, Bob is my neighbor at Lakeview Gardens. Pleasure, Bob said politely, extending his hand. Judith accepted the handshake with visible reluctance, as if concerned his middle-class status might somehow be contagious. Indeed. Are you also a teacher? The slight pause before the word made it clear she considered the profession barely worth mentioning. Architect, actually, Bob replied pleasantly. Retired now, of course, but I spent 40 years designing civic buildings throughout the Midwest. Perhaps you've noticed the new public library in Grand Rapids. That was one of my final projects. I had to suppress a smile at the subtle way Bob had established his professional credentials, effectively neutralizing Judith's attempt at condescension. From her momentary expression of surprise, I could tell she was reassessing her initial dismissal of him. How interesting, she managed, her tone suggesting it was anything but. Turning back to me, she adopted a conciliatory expression that immediately put me on guard. Martha, I was hoping we might have a moment to clear the air. There seem to have been some misunderstandings recently. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Daniel and Vanessa have gotten some rather peculiar ideas, she went on, her voice lowered as if sharing a confidence. About Thanksgiving arrangements, about their financial decisions about a number of things. I can't help but wonder if perhaps your influence might be behind this sudden change in attitude. I assure you, I replied evenly, Daniel and Vanessa are fully capable of making their own decisions. If those decisions no longer align with your preferences, that's something you'll need to discuss with them directly. Judith's carefully maintained facade slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of genuine anger. Let's not play games. Martha, we both know what's happening here. You've inserted yourself back into their lives, using your financial leverage to turn them against me. I felt Bob stiffen beside me, but I placed a restraining hand on his arm. This was my battle. To fight. Judith, I said quietly, I've known you for 12 years, ever since Daniel and Vanessa started dating. In all that time, you've made it abundantly clear that you consider my family inferior to yours. You've undermined my relationship with my son, tried to erase me from my grandchildren's lives, and used your financial resources to control your daughter's choices. And when that control was threatened, you retaliated by cutting them off. I paused, watching her face flush with indignation, then continued calmly. So please don't accuse me of using money as leverage. Unlike you, I've never made my love conditional on compliance. For a moment, Judith seemed genuinely speechless, unaccustomed to such direct confrontation. Before she could recover, I spotted Vanessa and the children returning through the crowd, their arms laden with festival purchases and treats. Ah, here they are now, I observed pleasantly. I'm sure they'll be delighted to see you. Judith turned, her expression rapidly shifting to one of grandmotherly affection as Emma and Noah approached. The children's reactions, however, were less than enthusiastic. Noah ducked slightly behind his mother, while Emma's smile became fixed and polite rather than genuinely welcoming. Grandmother, Emma greeted her formally. We didn't know you were coming to the festival. I wanted to surprise you, darling, Judith cooed, reaching out to touch Emma's hair. And to invite you all to a special pre-Thanksgiving outing next weekend. I've arranged a shopping trip to Chicago. We can stay at the Peninsula Hotel, visit the American Girl store, have tea at the Drake. Doesn't that sound lovely? Emma glanced at her mother, clearly uncertain how to respond. Vanessa stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. Mother, we've already discussed this. We have plans for next weekend, and our Thanksgiving arrangements are set. Yes, but surely those can be changed, Judith insisted, her voice taking on a harder edge despite her smile. The children should have these experiences, Vanessa. You're being selfish, denying them opportunities because of some petty disagreement between us. I watched Vanessa's face, seeing the familiar pattern begin to play out, the guilt, the doubt, the gradual caving to her mother's pressure. But then something shifted in her expression, a sudden resolution replacing the uncertainty. "No, Mother," she said firmly. "The children have been looking forward to helping their grandmother prepare for Thanksgiving. Martha's teaching them how to make her apple pie. That's the opportunity I won't deny them, the chance to build real relationships with all their family, not just the ones with the most impressive material offerings." Judith's face flushed dark with anger. "I see. So this is how it's going to be? You choose her over me? After everything I've done for you? For those children?" "It's not about choosing sides," Vanessa replied, her voice steady despite the public nature of this confrontation. "It's about creating healthy boundaries. You're always welcome in our lives, Mother, but not as the person who dictates our choices or undermines other family relationships." Throughout this exchange, I remained silent, deeply proud of Vanessa's courage, but unwilling to intervene in what was fundamentally her battle to fight. The children had edged closer to Bob and me, sensing the tension, but perhaps feeling safer in our vicinity. "I think perhaps we should continue this discussion another time," Judith finally said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "When we can speak privately." With a last glance at the children and a particularly venomous look in my direction, she turned and walked away, her rigid posture conveying her fury more clearly than words could have. Once she was out of earshot, Vanessa let out a shaky breath. "Well, that was intense." "You handled it beautifully," I told her sincerely. "Did I?" She looked genuinely uncertain. "It felt awful. I've never spoken to her that way before." "Sometimes the right thing feels terrible in the moment," Bob observed quietly. "Doesn't make it any less right." Vanessa gave him a grateful smile, then turned to the children who were watching with wide eyes. "How about we check out that sailboat now? I think we could all use a change of scenery." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic agreement from Emma and Noah, effectively breaking the tension of the moment. The marina sparkled in the late afternoon sunlight, boats of all sizes gently bobbing in their slips as we made our way down the weathered wooden dock. Bob led our small procession, pointing out interesting vessels and explaining nautical terms that made Noah giggle with delight. Emma walked beside me, her hand occasionally brushing against mine in a gesture that seemed both casual and deliberate, a quiet affirmation of our reconnection. "There she is," Bob announced proudly, stopping before a sleek sailboat with gleaming white hull and polished brass fittings. "The Second Chance." "You named your boat Second Chance?" I asked, immediately understanding the significance of his choice. He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Seemed appropriate at the time, even more so now. The children didn't catch our exchange, too busy marveling at the vessel that, while modest by some standards, appeared grand and adventurous to their young eyes. Noah immediately bombarded Bob with questions about speed and navigation, while Emma examined the craftsmanship with a more critical eye, running her fingers along the smooth railings. "Can we go aboard?" she asked, looking to both Bob and Vanessa for permission. "Of course," Bob replied, extending his hand to help her step from the dock onto the gently rocking deck. "Careful now, watch your step." One by one, we boarded the Second Chance, with Bob giving an impromptu tour of the compact but efficiently designed space. The main cabin was cozy rather than cramped, with clever built-in storage and comfortable seating that converted to sleeping berths. A small galley contained the essentials for preparing simple meals, and the navigation station, though equipped with modern electronics, still retained traditional charts and instruments that delighted the children. "Did you design all this yourself?" Vanessa asked, clearly impressed by the thoughtful layout. "Some of it," Bob admitted. "The boat was in rough shape when I bought her after Janet passed. Renovating it gave me something to focus on during that first difficult year. A purpose. You know?" I nodded, understanding completely. My own journey through grief had lacked such a tangible project, but I recognized the healing power of having something meaningful to pour one's energy into when the heart is broken. While Bob took the children up to the bow to show them how the sails worked, Vanessa moved to stand beside me at the stern, where we watched the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the lake in shades of gold and amber. "This is nice," she said softly. "Peaceful." "It is," I agreed, though I suspect actual sailing is a bit more exciting than this dockside experience. Vanessa smiled, then turned to face me directly. "I meant all of this. Today, the time together, seeing you happy. It's nice. After everything that happened, I wasn't sure we'd ever get here." "Neither was I admitted, "but I'm grateful we have." "Martha," she hesitated, then continued, with determination. "I want to apologize properly, not just for the trust fund situation, but for everything. The way I let my mother influence our family, the way I supported Daniel in keeping the children from you. It was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." The sincerity in her voice brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a great deal to me." She nodded, seeming relieved to have the words spoken aloud at last. "Daniel wanted to be here today too, you know. He's working on a case that couldn't wait, but he asked me to tell you that he's meeting with Stanley next week about adjusting our loan terms. He wants to set up a proper repayment schedule, with interest." This surprising news, that my son was taking full responsibility for the financial arrangement, rather than treating it as a family obligation, suggested a shift in his attitude I hadn't anticipated. "That's unexpected." "He's changing," Vanessa said with a small smile. "We both are. This whole experience has been something of a wake-up call." Before I could respond, Emma's voice called from the bow. "Grandma, come look. You can see the whole town from up here." The tour of the Second Chance continued for another hour, with Bob patiently answering every question and demonstrating the various systems that kept the vessel functional and safe. By the time we disembarked, the sun was setting in earnest, casting long shadows across the marina. "Can we go sailing sometime?" Noah asked eagerly as we walked back to our cars. "Like, actually out on the water with the sails up?" Bob glanced at me before answering. "I think that could be arranged if it's all right with your parents and grandmother. Maybe next spring when the weather warms up again." "That's forever from now," Noah groaned dramatically. "It'll come faster than you think," I assured him, ruffling his hair affectionately. "And think how much you'll have to look forward to." As we said our goodbyes in the parking lot, I was struck by how natural it felt, this new configuration of family and friendship. Vanessa hugged me warmly, promising to call with details about Thanksgiving plans. The children extracted promises about future visits and sailing adventures, their earlier distress at Judith's appearance seemingly forgotten in the excitement of the day. When they had gone, Bob and I lingered by his car, reluctant to end the day despite our exhaustion. "Thank you," I said sincerely, "for everything today, the festival, the boat tour, your support during that unpleasant encounter with Judith. It meant a lot to have you there." "I was happy to be included," he replied, his eyes warm in the fading light. "Your family is lovely, Martha. I can see why you fought so hard to keep them in your life." "They are," I agreed, though we still have healing to do. Rebuilding trust takes time. Bob nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of time," he said, his tone shifting to something more hesitant. "I was wondering if you might be free for dinner tomorrow. Night? Just the two of us. There's a little Italian place in town I've been meaning to try." The flutter in my chest returned, stronger this time. "Bob Henderson," I said with mock severity. "Are you asking me on a date?" His laugh was soft but genuine. "I suppose I am. Seems about time, don't you think?" "I'd love to have dinner with you," I replied, feeling suddenly ridiculously young despite my 68 years. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving passed in a pleasant blur of activity. My life, which had once been defined by emptiness and loss, now overflowed with connection and purpose. I continued tutoring at the community center, finding particular joy in the progress of my young students. The Golden Years Club remained a constant source of friendship and laughter, with my dinner party, postponed but not forgotten, finally, taking place to great success. And then there was Bob. Our first date led to a second, then a third, each evening together deepening our connection and confirming what I had begun to suspect from our earliest encounters. Here was a man with whom I could build something meaningful, a relationship based on mutual respect, shared experiences, and genuine affection. "You're glowing these days," Eleanor observed during one of our weekly coffee meetings. "Romance clearly agrees with you." I blushed, despite myself. "It's not just Bob," I insisted, though his presence in my life was certainly a significant factor in my happiness. "It's everything. Having the children back, reconnecting with Daniel and Vanessa, finding my place here at Lakeview Gardens. For the first time since Frank died, I feel like I'm truly living again, not just existing." "And the money?" Eleanor asked carefully. "Any regrets about the loan to Daniel?" I considered this question seriously. "No," I said finally. "The $2 million in trust for Emma and Noah is secure, and the loan to Daniel and Vanessa is being properly documented and repaid. But even if they never repaid a penny, it would have been worth it to heal our family." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "You've handled this whole situation with remarkable grace, Martha. Not everyone would have found their way to forgiveness after being cut off from their grandchildren like that." "It's not about being saintly," I clarified. "It's about recognizing what truly matters. The money was never as important as the relationships." As Thanksgiving approached, preparations intensified. Vanessa called almost daily with questions about recipes and traditions, determined to create a meaningful celebration in their more modest home. I spent hours baking pies and preparing side dishes that could be easily transported, while Emma and Noah visited my condo regularly to help and learn family recipes. The day before Thanksgiving, as I was packaging cranberry relish made according to Frank's mother's recipe, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Martha Wilson?" A crisp female voice inquired when I answered. "Yes, speaking." "This is Judith Parker." My hand froze on the spatula I'd been using. "Hello, Judith. This is unexpected." "Yes, well," she cleared her throat awkwardly. "I'll be direct. Vanessa has informed me that I'm welcome at Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow, provided I can be civil to all guests, including you." "I see," I replied neutrally, waiting for her to continue. "I'm calling to—" She paused, the words clearly difficult for her. "To ensure there won't be unpleasantness if I attend. The children have expressed a desire for my presence, and I don't wish to disappoint them." It wasn't an apology, not even close, but from a woman like Judith Parker, this conciliatory approach represented a significant concession. I thought of Emma and Noah, of the importance of extended family even when relationships are complicated, and made my decision. "I have no interest in creating tension during a family holiday," I assured her. "If you can be civil, so can I." "Good," she said briskly, her businesslike tone returning. "That's settled then. I understand you're bringing desserts? I'll provide the wine. I assume you still prefer Chardonnay." The fact that she remembered my wine preference after all these years was surprising. "Yes, though these days I'm equally fond of a good Pinot Grigio." "I'll bring both," she decided. After an awkward pause, she added stiffly, "Thank you, Martha, for your flexibility in this matter." Coming from Judith, it was practically an olive branch. "Family is complicated," I replied simply, "but it's worth the effort." After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for several minutes, processing the conversation. It was unlikely that Judith and I would ever be friends, or even particularly warm towards each other. But perhaps for the sake of Emma and Noah, for the sake of Daniel and Vanessa, who were working so hard to create a healthier family dynamic, we could establish a civil coexistence. Thanksgiving Day dawned bright and clear, the kind of crisp, autumn morning that seemed designed for gratitude. Bob had offered to drive me to Daniel and Vanessa's house, insisting that it would be easier than trying to transport multiple pies and side dishes on my own. Though he had a standing invitation to join us, he had gently declined. "First family Thanksgiving after everything that's happened? That's not the time to introduce the new boyfriend," he'd said, with characteristic sensitivity. "You all need this time together, just family." The fact that he understood this, without offense or insecurity, only confirmed what I already knew. That Bob Henderson was a rare and wonderful man, secure enough in himself and in our relationship to give me the space I needed. When we arrived at Daniel and Vanessa's home, I was struck by the transformation that had taken place since my last visit. Gone were many of the ostentatious decorative items that had once filled the space, replaced by simpler, more personal touches. Family photographs now dominated the walls, including several of Frank that I had given them from my collection. Emma and Noah rushed to greet me, their excitement palpable as they helped carry dishes into the kitchen. Vanessa, wearing an apron, dusted with flour and looking happier than I had seen her in years, embraced me warmly. "Everything's almost ready," she assured me. "Though I'm not entirely confident about the turkey. It looks rather... well, you'll see." Daniel appeared, from the dining room where he had been setting the table. For a moment he hesitated, then stepped forward to hug me with genuine affection. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom," he said softly. "Thank you for coming." "I wouldn't be anywhere else," I replied, returning his embrace. The doorbell rang, announcing Judith's arrival. A brief flash of tension rippled through the room before Vanessa squared her shoulders and went to answer it. We all held our breath, waiting to see how this potentially volatile addition to our gathering would unfold. Judith entered with characteristic poise, impeccably dressed as always, but somewhat less intimidating without her usual entourage of designer shopping bags and extravagant gifts. She carried only 2 bottles of wine, a Chardonnay and a Pinot Grigio, as promised, and a small arrangement of autumn flowers. "Happy Thanksgiving," she greeted the room at large, her gaze lingering briefly on me before moving to the children. "Emma, Noah, come give your grandmother a hug." As the children dutifully complied, I noticed something I had never seen before in Judith's interactions with them, a genuine softening of her expression, a warmth that suggested perhaps her affection for her grandchildren wasn't entirely for show. It was a humanizing glimpse beneath her carefully maintained facade. The meal itself was a minor miracle of cooperation and restraint. Judith limited her critical comments about the food to just one observation about the turkey's creative appearance, which even Vanessa could laugh about given the bird's admittedly lopsided presentation. Daniel spoke enthusiastically about his new position at the smaller firm, emphasizing the improved work-life balance rather than the reduction in salary. When it came time for dessert, Emma insisted on serving my apple pie herself, proudly announcing to the table that she had helped make it and was learning all of Grandma Martha's secret recipes. "That's wonderful, dear," Judith said with only the faintest hint of disapproval. "Though perhaps next time I can show you how to make my famous chocolate soufflé." It was always a favorite at the country club fundraisers. Instead of the competitive tension such a comment might once have created, Vanessa smiled serenely. "Emma would love that, wouldn't you, honey? And maybe you can teach grandmother your snickerdoodle recipe in exchange." The subtle repositioning, acknowledging. Judith's skill while maintaining the value of family traditions not based on social prestige was masterfully done. I caught Vanessa's eye across the table and offered a small nod of appreciation for her diplomatic handling of the moment. As the afternoon stretched into evening, I observed the shifting dynamics of this family that had been so fractured just months before. Daniel, more relaxed than I had seen him in years, played board games with the children instead of checking his phone for work emails. Vanessa and Judith managed a civil conversation about Vanessa's new job, with Judith eventually admitting that her marketing expertise might actually be valuable in the corporate world. And I, the grandmother who had once been deemed expendable, found myself at the center of it all, included in every conversation, consulted on family decisions, my presence not just tolerated, but actively valued. When it was time to leave, Daniel walked me to the door. "It was a good day," he said, sounding almost surprised by the observation. "It was," I agreed. "Different from what we're used to, but good." He hesitated, then said quietly, "I've been thinking a lot about Dad lately, about what he would think of everything that's happened." The mention of Frank, especially from Daniel, who had rarely spoken of his father since the funeral, caught me by surprise. "What conclusions have you reached?" I asked gently. "That he would be disappointed in how I handled things," Daniel admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "But probably also proud of how we're fixing it. He always said the measure of a man isn't whether he makes mistakes, but how he corrects them." "He did say that," I confirmed, touched that Daniel remembered this particular piece of his father's wisdom. "And he would be proud of you now, Daniel, of the changes you're making, of the father and husband you're becoming." My son's eyes glistened, with unshed tears. "I miss him, especially on days like today." "I know," I said softly. "So do I. But he's here in all the ways that matter. In Emma's laugh that sounds just like his, in Noah's curiosity about how things work, in the values we're trying to pass on to them." Daniel nodded, wiping discreetly at his eyes. "Thanks, Mom, for everything. For not giving up on us, even when we gave you every reason to." As I drove home that evening, my heart full of the day's memories, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 6 months ago, I had been a woman defined by loss, of my husband, my sense of purpose, and ultimately, my connection to my grandchildren. The $2 million I had carefully set aside for Emma and Noah's future had become not a gift of love, but a weapon used against me, a tool for manipulation and control. Now, that same money remained secure in its trust, but its significance had fundamentally changed. No longer was it the focal point of family conflict or the measure of my worth as a grandmother. Instead, it had resumed its intended role, a practical expression of love, a concrete way to secure opportunities for the next generation. More importantly, I had discovered that the true wealth in my life had nothing to do with financial resources. It lay in the relationships I had fought to preserve, in the new connections I had formed, in the community I had built around myself at Lakeview Gardens, and in the surprising second chance at romance that had blossomed with Bob. As I pulled into my parking space at the condo, I noticed a familiar figure waiting on my patio, a warm glow emanating from the string lights I had recently installed along the railing. "You're still up," I observed as I approached Bob, who rose to greet me with a gentle kiss. "Couldn't sleep without hearing how it went," he admitted. "The full Thanksgiving report." I smiled, taking his hand and leading him inside, where the warmth and comfort of my new home enveloped us. As we settled on the sofa, his arm around my shoulders and a sense of peaceful contentment surrounding us, I began to tell him about the day, the laughter and minor tensions, the subtle shifts in family dynamics, the moments of genuine connection that had surprised and delighted me. "It sounds like a success," he observed when I had finished my account. "It was," I agreed. "Not perfect, but real. And that's worth more than perfection." Bob nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when Janet was sick, toward the end, she made me promise something. She said, 'Don't waste time being lonely. Find someone who makes you happy and grab onto that chance with both hands. My heart quickened at the serious turn in his tone. Wise woman, your Janet. She was, he agreed. And I've been thinking about her advice a lot lately. He shifted slightly to face me more directly. Martha, I know we haven't known each other very long in the grand scheme of things. But at our age, I think we recognize something good when we find it. We do, I agreed softly, hardly daring to hope where this conversation might be leading. I'm not proposing marriage, he clarified with a small smile. At least not yet. But I am proposing something. Next summer, I'm planning to take the second chance on an extended cruise along the Great Lakes. 3 months, visiting coastal towns, exploring places neither of us has seen before. I'd very much like you to come with me. The invitation, so much more significant than a simple vacation, offer, hung in the air between us, full of promise and possibility. 3 months on a sailboat together is quite a commitment, I observed, though my heart had already made its decision. It is, Bob acknowledged. But I think we're ready for it. And if not, well, there are plenty of ports where you could jump, ship, and catch a bus home. I laughed at his practical contingency plan, so characteristic of his thoughtful nature. I won't need the escape route, I assured him, taking his hand in mine. I'd love to join you on the second chance, Bob. In fact, I can't think of a more perfect way to celebrate this new chapter. As he gathered me into his arms, I thought of Frank's letter, of his certainty that I was stronger than I knew, of his encouragement to live fully rather than exist in the shadow of loss. I had saved $2 million for my grandchildren's future, ensuring they would have the resources to pursue their dreams and build their lives. But in standing firm against manipulation, in refusing to be erased from their lives, I had given them something even more valuable, an example of dignity, courage, and self-respect. And in the process, I had given myself the greatest gift of all, a life reclaimed, a future embraced, and the profound understanding that it's never too late to make the decision to start anew. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.